My father unrolled his crude, hand-drawn blueprint across my polished oak drafting table, the paper scratching faintly against the wood. "With my building experience and your drawing skills," he said, his voice thick with unearned pride, "we can finally make some real money together." 10 years, 10 years of silence since he'd looked me in the eye and told me my $60,000 college fund was being reallocated to my brother's wedding. And now, he stood in the life I had built from the ashes of that promise, not asking for forgiveness, but demanding a partnership. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Eliza. When I was 17, my entire world existed on a 4-foot by 3-foot drafting table in the corner of my bedroom. It was a landscape of sharp lines and precise angles, of miniature houses built from balsa wood and dreams, each one a stepping stone toward my application to Virginia Tech's architecture program. My future felt tangible, something I could design and build with my own hands. That future was underwritten by a promise, a number that lived on a chart taped to our refrigerator door, the college fund my parents, David and Susan, had started for me when I was a child. $60,000. They called it their investment in the family's brain. And my father would proudly tap the glass over the rising balance after every deposit. That chart was the foundation upon which all my hard work was built. To cover my own expenses for drafting supplies and books, I worked part-time at a local coffee shop. The scent of roasted beans and burnt sugar clung to my clothes, a constant reminder of the hours I spent on my feet, wiping down counters and forcing a smile for customers. I didn't mind the work. It was a means to an end. Every night, I'd come home, the exhaustion settling deep in my bones, and I'd sit at my table under the glow of a single lamp, losing myself in the clean, quiet world of blueprints until the sky outside began to soften into dawn. My life had a rhythm, a purpose. I was building something. My older brother, Mark, never seemed to build anything at all. He drifted through life with an easy charm and a guitar he played just well enough to be interesting at parties. He was the golden child, the one whose failures were framed as finding himself and whose minor accomplishments were celebrated like triumphs, while I saved for months to buy a specific set of architectural rulers. My father would come home with a new expensive guitar pedal for Mark, a casual gift to encourage his artistic spirit. I never felt jealousy. Not exactly. It was more like a quiet acceptance of the family's gravitational pull, a force that always tilted everything in his direction. I was the responsible one, the sure bet. So my path was taken for granted. His was a winding road that required constant support and attention. That all changed the evening Mark came home with a diamond ring on his fiancée's finger. Suddenly, the entire household was consumed with planning a wedding that, as my mother repeatedly said, had to be tasteful and appropriate for his new in-laws. The guest list grew, the venue options became more extravagant, and the quiet hum of my future was drowned out by the roar of my brother's present. I watched from the sidelines, feeling a growing unease as the numbers being thrown around started to sound terrifyingly familiar. The dam finally broke during a steak dinner on a Tuesday night. My father cleared his throat, the sound loud in the sudden silence, and made the announcement without ever looking at me directly. "The family has made a decision," he began, placing his knife and fork down with a sense of finality. "We're going to use Eliza's college fund to pay for the wedding. It's more important for your brother to have a proper start to his life. It's an investment in the family's immediate future." I stared at him, the bite of food in my mouth suddenly tasteless. My mother nodded eagerly, adding, "Exactly. You can always go to community college for a couple of years." "Eliza, it's all the same in the end. Besides, it's our money. We're just reallocating the capital to where it's needed most right now." My voice felt like a stranger's when I finally found it. "But that's my fund," I whispered, the words barely audible. "You told me that money was for my education." My father finally turned to look at me, but there was no sympathy in his eyes, only a hard, dismissive glint. He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Your money? Did you earn a single dollar of it? When you can build something yourself, then you can talk to me about what's fair." He gestured vaguely toward the corner of the dining room, where my most detailed architectural model sat on a pedestal, a project that had taken me 6 months to complete. His words hit me harder than a physical blow. He had taken my dream, paid for with his money, and used it as a weapon to silence me. The rest of dinner passed in a blur. They moved on to discussing floral arrangements while I sat there, a ghost at their table, the foundation of my life reduced to rubble around me. In the weeks that followed, I tried to reason with them. I brought them my acceptance letter from Virginia Tech. I showed them the tuition costs. I pleaded with them to reconsider, to take out a loan, to do anything else each time. I was met with the same impenetrable wall of logic. Family comes first. Mark needs this. You're smart. You'll figure it out. The phrase family first began to feel like a curse, a justification for any injustice, as long as I was the one paying the price. The fund was drained completely to pay for a wedding that felt more like a coronation. They paid for a string quartet, an ice sculpture in the shape of a swan, and a champagne toast for 200 guests. My future had been liquidated for a 4-hour party. I stood at the reception in a dress my mother had insisted on buying me, a beige, shapeless thing that made me feel even more invisible. I watched my parents glow with pride as they mingled, accepting congratulations on a beautiful wedding and a wonderful son. They had successfully launched him into the next phase of his life by dismantling mine. While Mark and his new wife danced under a canopy of fairy lights, I slipped out the side door. The cool night air felt like a relief. I walked to the edge of the parking lot and sat on the hood of my beat-up car, the same car I used to drive to the coffee shop at 5 in the morning. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my dad. "Don't wander off. Family photos soon." I didn't answer. I looked up at the stars and felt a cold, hard resolve settle in my chest. If they wouldn't invest in me, I would have to do it myself, and I would do it alone. The morning after the wedding, the house was littered with wilted flowers and half-empty glasses. My parents were at the kitchen table, sipping coffee as if nothing monumental had happened. They were basking in the afterglow, recounting speeches and compliments from guests. I came downstairs with a duffel bag packed. I told them I was moving into a small apartment closer to the community college. My mother simply smiled, distracted. "That's responsible of you, dear," she said, before turning back to my father to comment on the photographer. They didn't see my departure as a rupture. They saw it as a practical decision. They didn't see me at all. Life became a grueling routine of classes I felt no passion for, and 2 jobs that left me perpetually exhausted. I was a barista in the mornings and a stock clerk at a grocery store in the evenings. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. The vibrant, detailed world of architecture was replaced by the gray reality of textbooks on basic accounting and the acrid smell of floor cleaner. I barely heard from my family, except for the occasional group text showcasing Mark's new life, a photo of his new apartment, furnished with expensive gifts, news of his honeymoon in Hawaii. Each update was a bitter reminder of what my $60,000 had bought. The final straw came during my second year of community college. I had poured every spare moment, every ounce of remaining creative energy, into a statewide design competition for students. It was a long shot, but I worked on my submission with a feverish intensity. To my astonishment, I won. It wasn't a huge amount, just $5,000. But to me, it was everything. It was enough to buy the professional-grade architectural software I desperately needed, the kind of program that could turn my ideas into something real, something that could get me noticed by a 4-year university. It felt like a lifeline. I made the mistake of telling my parents the good news. A week later, my mother called, her voice laced with a carefully constructed panic. Mark's car had broken down, a major engine failure, and he needed it for the new sales job my father had helped him get. They were a little tight on cash after the wedding, she explained. She insisted it was a temporary loan. They just needed maybe $3,000 to help him out. The $5,000 prize I had just won was a godsend, she said. It was like fate. They promised, absolutely promised. They would pay me back in 6 months. As soon as Mark got his first commission check, I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. But she was my mother. She sounded so desperate. She made me feel selfish for even hesitating. So, I transferred them the money. 6 months passed, then 7. I called to ask about it, and my mother was evasive. Mark's job wasn't panning out as expected. They'd had some unexpected expenses. "Don't worry, honey. We haven't forgotten," she'd say, her voice bright and brittle. But I knew they had. They hadn't forgotten. They just didn't care. That $5,000 wasn't a loan. It was a tax, a fee I had to pay for my own success, a resource to be tapped for the endless needs of my brother. That was the day I stopped waiting. I stopped waiting for them to see me, to value me, to pay me back. I stopped waiting for them to be the parents I needed them to be. I filled out a single application to a state university in Colorado, packed everything I owned into 2 boxes in a suitcase, and bought a one-way bus ticket to Denver. I left without saying goodbye. Denver was a harsh and lonely rebirth. I found a cramped room for rent in a house with 3 other people and got a job waiting tables. All the money I earned went toward tuition and rent. I was perpetually cold, perpetually hungry, and perpetually tired. But for the first time, I felt a spark of freedom. My life, as meager as it was entirely my own. I enrolled in the university's architecture program and threw myself into my studies, while other students went to parties. I stayed in the library, while they complained about 8 a.m. to our classes. I was already an hour into my shift at the diner. I was fueled by coffee and a quiet, burning anger that I channeled into my work. During my junior year, I landed an internship at a small local architecture firm. It was mostly grunt work, making coffee, organizing blueprints, running errands, but I watched everything. I listened to the partners discuss zoning laws and client feedback. I stayed late, teaching myself the software I couldn't afford, practicing on the office computers after everyone had gone home. The firm's senior partner, a tough, no-nonsense man named Arthur, started to notice. He saw me there late one night and didn't scold me. He walked over, looked at my screen, and pointed out a more efficient way to render a 3D model. That was the beginning of my real education. After I graduated, Arthur offered me a full-time position as a junior draftsman. The pay was modest, but it was enough to finally quit the diner. For the first time since I was 17, I had one job, one focus. My life began to take shape. The next few years were a blur of hard work. My days began before the city's streetlights faded and often ended long after they flickered on again. I took on the difficult projects no one else wanted. I learned about sustainable materials, about navigating city permits, about managing client expectations. My anger slowly cooled, transforming from a raging fire into a focused, powerful engine. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building. By the time I was 30, I had made a name for myself within the Denver design community. I specialized in sustainable, energy-efficient homes, a niche that was just beginning to boom. Arthur made me a junior partner. My salary jumped. I paid off my student loans in an aggressive, systematic purge, watching the balance drop with a grim satisfaction. I bought a small condo downtown and spent a year renovating it myself, turning it into a minimalist, light-filled space that was the physical manifestation of the clarity I finally felt. My life was quiet, orderly, and entirely of my own making. Then, after almost 10 years of near total silence, my parents decided to re-enter my life. It started with a phone call from my mother. Her voice was artificially bright, full of a warmth I didn't trust. She said they'd heard from a distant cousin that I was doing well in Denver. She asked about my work, her questions vague and polite. I kept my answers short and noncommittal. A few weeks later, my father called after some awkward small talk. He got to the point. His contracting business was struggling, and they owned a small undeveloped plot of land on the outskirts of our old hometown. Their nest egg, their last hope. They had an idea. He said, a big one. They wanted to build a small, high-end, eco-friendly housing development, and they needed an architect. They wanted me to help out the family and design it for them. The audacity of it almost made me laugh. After a decade of silence, they didn't call to apologize, to reconnect, or to ask how I was. They called because they needed something, against my better judgment. A cold, clinical curiosity took hold of me. I told them to come to Denver to discuss it. I wanted to see them. I wanted them to see me, to see what I had become, not in spite of them, but without them. They arrived at my firm's downtown office on a bright Tuesday morning. I watched from my glass-walled office as they stepped out of the elevator, looking overwhelmed and out of place among the sleek concrete floors and modern furniture. My mother wore a dress that was a little too fancy. My father clutched a worn leather briefcase like a shield. I let them wait in the reception area for 5 minutes before I came out to greet them. I was polite, professional. I led them into the large conference room, the one with a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city. They were visibly impressed, and their attempts to hide it were almost painful to watch. "Nice place, Eliza," my father said, running his hand along the edge of the massive oak conference table. "Making good money, are you?" I just smiled and offered them coffee. Then I sat back and listened as they laid out their plan. It was, as I suspected, a half-baked idea built on wishful thinking. They had no investors, no clear budget, and no understanding of the market. After they finished their rambling pitch, my father opened his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a crude, hand-drawn sketch of a few houses on a plot of land, done in pencil. He slid it across the polished surface of the table toward me. He leaned forward, a conspiratorial gleam in his eye. "With my building experience and your drawing skills," he said, tapping the paper, "we can finally make some real money together." The word together hung in the air, a grotesque mockery of everything that had passed between us. He saw me not as a daughter, not even as a successful professional, but as a resource, a tool, the final missing piece to his own failed ambitions. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching the confidence drain from his face as I simply stared at him. Then, I reached into a folder I had prepared and slid a single, professionally printed page across the table to him. It wasn't a contract or a design proposal. It was a simple statement of account. The first line item read, "Initial investment capital, September 2015. $60,000.00 was below. It was a clear, professionally calculated breakdown of what that sum would be worth today, with 10 years of compounded interest from a standard investment portfolio. At the bottom of the page, I had typed a single sentence. "This is my initial consultation fee. Once this outstanding invoice from our previous venture is settled, we can discuss my professional rates for any future projects." I watched as their eyes scanned the page. I saw the exact moment the meaning behind the words registered. My mother's face went pale. My father's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked up at me, his eyes full of a baffled rage. For the first time in my life, I had presented them with a bill for what they had cost me, written in the only language they truly understood: money. "I have another meeting now," I said, my voice calm and even as I stood up. "Thank you for coming in." I walked out of the conference room without a backward glance, leaving them alone with the invoice and the 10-year-old echo of their own betrayal. The texts and calls started that night, a string of messages from my mother, moving from wounded indignation to outright guilt-tripping. "How could you humiliate us like that? We did what we thought was best." A call from Mark, his voice strained. telling me I was selfish, that I had no idea how hard things had been for them. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply replied to each of them with the same 4 words. The invoice is outstanding. Then I blocked their numbers. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the lonely silence of abandonment. It was the clean, quiet peace of a door firmly closed. The next morning, I woke up early and drove out to a construction site on the edge of the city. It was one of my projects. A community center I had designed pro bono for a local nonprofit. I put on a hard hat and walked through the skeleton of the building as the sun rose, the frame catching the first golden rays of light. My father had been right about one thing all those years ago. You only have a right to speak when you've built something yourself. And standing there, in the quiet morning air, surrounded by the tangible proof of my own hard work, my own vision, I knew I had finally built a life so strong, on a foundation so solid, that no one could ever take it away from me again. The most profound journeys often begin not with a step forward, but with the ground giving way beneath us. They start when the very people meant to be our foundation become the source of our deepest fractures. It's a quiet, painful lesson to learn that your worth is not a family asset to be liquidated for someone else's comfort. And your future is not a loan to be called in at their convenience. True resilience is rarely loud. It is not found in screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. It is built in silence, in the lonely hours of relentless work, in the steady, determined act of laying a new foundation, brick by painful brick, upon the ruins of a promise. It's the slow, powerful realization that you do not need the approval of those who are willing to sacrifice you. Your success is not for them to witness. It is the air you finally get to breathe. And closure is not always about forgiveness. Sometimes, it is simply the quiet, steady click of a door you have finally, peacefully, closed for good. Thank you so much for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience and self-discovery. Stories like this remind us of the incredible strength of the human spirit. We would be honored to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of this story resonated with you the most? Your insights and personal reflections are what make this community so special. If you are moved by the story and believe in the power of narrative, please consider subscribing to our channel and turning on notifications. You'll be the first to know when we share a new tale. We are so grateful to have you here with us. Until next time.